Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another edition of our podcast, Workforce Rewired. I am Dr. Cheryl Richards with Catapult Employers Association, and again, am joined by John Oxford, who is the president and CEO of L&M Companies and a proud board member of ours. And John has been featured on our podcast previously. Thanks for coming back to do this again with me.
Certainly, my pleasure. Thank you.
So today, a very fun topic. We're going to talk about what employees actually want versus what employers need. And so I guess my first question to you, John, is in your experience, how wide is the gap really between what employees want and what employers need?
Cheryl, I think that's a great place to start because I actually think the gap gets overstated sometimes. In my experience, most employees aren't really asking for anything unreasonable. They want fair pay, clear communication, some level of flexibility, and probably most importantly, to feel respected. And from the employer side, we need performance, accountability, consistency. That's how the business runs. But I think where the gap shows up isn't in what people want, it's in how those expectations are understood and perhaps communicated. Employees can say, feel like leadership only cares about the numbers, and employers can feel like employees don't understand the constraints of the business. But I think the truth is both sides want a stable, healthy workplace. The issue is usually trust and clarity, not completely, let's say, opposing priorities.
I think you framed that really well for this conversation because we do make assumptions a lot of times on those gaps, and getting some of that clarity helps. So, if you had to name one thing that you think employees say they want most right now, today, what is that?
If I had to narrow it down to one thing, and this just happens to be our first value in terms of our core values for our company, so I'm probably a little biased, but I'd say it's respect. But I'd
Mhm.
say in practical terms, because it shows up in a number of different ways. Respect for their time, being listened to and valued, clear and candid and honest communication, consistency in how decisions are made. Oftentimes people think it's just about pay, but I don't think it's just about pay. It's about people, about whether people feel like they're being treated as professionals and that their contributions actually matter. In a mid-sized company like ours, that's something that we can control a little more directly. When leadership is visible, the communication is candid and clear, and expectations are consistent, I think employees do feel that respect.
Mhm. So some might say that leaders assume that it comes down to the money, and you have made a different argument here. When you look past pay, what do employees actually want that you think employers consistently misread or underestimate?
You're right. I don't think it's just about pay. Now, certainly pay matters, but what I think is often underestimated is how much the employees want and value clarity and predictability. Our business, we have people that work hard all the time. I think people can handle the hard work. They can handle the change, but what's difficult is when the direction is unclear or the expectations are inconsistent or feeling like they're the last to know what's happening. I think what employees really value is knowing what's expected of them, having competent managers, and understanding why decisions are being made. And I've seen it over and over again. And we're not perfect at this, I'll just be clear about it. But I think when you communicate clearly and consistently, people are far more understanding, even when the decisions maybe don't go their way or they're tougher to swallow sometimes.
And I think a great example of this is the evolution that we've had since COVID, right, around flexibility in the workplace and remote work. And people want, employees, I would say, clearly want this flexibility in remote work. And 4-day work weeks or whatever it is now that's the latest flavor. But your business relies on people being on the ground and having that productivity and keeping the culture that you described. So, in your mind, where's the honest middle ground? And do you have any example of who's getting it right?
That's another great question. And I think the middle ground for us is pretty simple. The flexibility has to fit the work. In our business, we grow, harvest, pack, and distribute fresh vegetables and fruit. And as much as maybe people would like to think, there's certain things, a lot of things in that whole chain that you just cannot do remotely. You can't harvest sweet potatoes remotely. You can't pack bell peppers from your living room. You can't manage a warehouse from your home. So not every role can have the same flexibility. Where I think companies get it right is when they don't treat flexibility as a one size fits all. Instead, they ask, what does this role actually require? Where can we introduce flexibility without impacting performance? And how do we make that feel fair across team? Because again, that fairness factor is a tough one to wrestle with sometimes. For some roles, that might be hybrid work. For others, it might be more predictable schedules, better shift planning, or improved time off practices. In some roles, it just may be that, I'm sorry, but that role cannot be accomplished remotely. So flexibility in my mind doesn't always mean remote, but it does mean being thoughtful about how the work gets done.
And I think you hit on a really good point. Tend to define flexibility as equal, and flexibility isn't always equal necessarily. And so, great examples there of different roles in your company and where you get to that middle ground. We talked about this at the beginning when you were describing the gap not being necessarily as wide as some people may think. And I think a lot of people think that employee wants and business needs are just on opposite ends of the spectrum. And you clearly have said that's not necessarily the case. Where do you think things really line up? You've already given a couple examples. And then where do you think there is just some real unavoidable tension in between employee wants and business needs?
I think both of those things are going to be true in most business environments. You've just got to be able to distinguish between the two. I think my view would be that they align more than most people think. Employees want stability, growth, good leadership, and fairness, as I had talked about before. Employers want retention and strong performance and long-term success. And I think those things reinforce each other. Where the tension can become real is around, and this happens, businesses go through cycles, but when it comes to things like cost or specific operational needs, and sometimes timing, there are going to be moments when employees want more than the business can sustainably deliver, or when the business needs decisions that aren't going to be popular. And I think that's where leadership matters most. Not pretending that the tension doesn't exist, but being open and responsible in terms of how you manage your way through those situations.
Yeah. It's great advice, John. And you started out talking with us. One of the first questions that I said, you said it might be biased, but this is one of our top values at L&M, and it's respect. And I think we talk a lot about purpose and values at work. And so I'm curious, how much of that do you think that employees really want? Do they find purpose and value in their work versus how much is it something employers project onto them and say, these are our company values?
That's a great question, Cheryl. I feel very fortunate and blessed in many ways with the team of people that we have here at L&M. We go to great lengths to try to ensure that any candidates that we're talking to seriously about coming to work with us understand how important our core values are to our work and to our ability to achieve our vision. So for us, I would say I think our employees do care, but I would add in a very practical way. Most people at least I hope this is true because they're not getting it, honestly, but most people aren't looking for big inspirational messaging every day. What they're looking for is consistency. If we say we value people, do we treat them well under pressure? If we say safety matters, do we invest in it? If we say integrity matters, do we act that way when it's hard? And I think when you put all those together, purpose and values matter when they're visible. If they're just words on a page or on a PowerPoint slide or on something on the wall, I think people tune them out pretty quickly. So I'd add in our business, the purpose is pretty tangible, and we're growing fresh fruits and vegetables. We're supporting our customers and the consumers that shop or go out to eat with our customers. We're supporting the communities in which we live and work, and that resonates. But it only sticks if people or our employees see it reflected in how we operate day to day. We really do have to walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
Well, and when I think about that, walking the walk and talking the talk, I think about the times when that inspirational leadership matters, but also when leaders have to tell people no for whatever reason it is. And so I'm curious to know what separates in your mind the leaders whose teams stick around after hearing a no from the ones who watch people walk out the door.
Again, I'll say, as I said before, we're not perfect, so I wouldn't even pretend that. But I think a lot of it, I don't have to say no to some things. If you don't, you're just going to be like a ship without a rudder. So the answer sometimes will have to be no. And I think it comes down to how that no is delivered. People don't expect the leaders to say yes to everything, but what they do expect is, at least this is in my experience, honesty, clarity, and respect. There's that word again. And I think if you can explain the why and you can acknowledge the impact and show that you genuinely considered a lot of the different alternatives and any requests that might have been made, I think people are much more likely to accept the answer, even when they don't love it. I think where leaders tend to lose people is when they're vague or inconsistent or dismissive. And I guess I would add this, that I feel like good leaders don't default to no. Even if they can't say yes, they look for alternatives or compromises or future opportunities. And I think that helps build trust over time in the organization.
I think you're right here. The adage that when people don't get communication, they fill in the gaps. And so you've just given some real tangible advice to our listeners about that clarity of communication and expectation and not necessarily defaulting to no on the answer. John, just like we had last time, we are running out of time. These are always so fun for you, but I've got to ask you a final question here before we wrap up. And that is for a CEO who's trying to balance business priorities, maybe it's a tight budget against a workforce that's asking for more, whether that's flexibility or more pay or more something. What do you think there's one shift in thinking that could help them close that gap without breaking the business?
Another great question, Cheryl. I would say, if I had to boil it down to one thing, I think the biggest shift is thinking about this as a work design problem, not just a cost problem. Not everything employees want requires a big investment. A lot of improvements can come from things that I talked about earlier. Better communication, clearer expectations, having stronger, more competent managers, and more consistency. Those things can have a huge impact, and they often cost less than disengagement or turnover. Now, some investments do, or excuse me, some expectations do require investment, and leaders have to be disciplined about just what can the business support and afford. But if you start by asking, what's the problem employees are trying to solve, instead of just, what does this cost? I think you usually will find better, more sustainable solutions.
Some great advice as always. You say it very humbly. We're not perfect, but you're clearly doing a lot of things really well there at L&M. And this has been a really engaging and inspiring conversation about what employees want and what employers need. And I think, John, you've given us some great things to think about as we think about that gap being not as wide as perhaps many think it is. So thank you for once again being my guest on our podcast, The Workforce Rewired. And we'll have our listeners join us in again and send their thanks to you as well.
Great. Thank you.